It is 1938, and the pace of history is accelerating. Europe spirals towards war with an ever-increasing tension. 20 years previously, World War I had ended. The war to end all wars had been the product of deep tension between the nations of the continent. Germany jostling for its place as a great power. Germany collapsed in defeat, but remained the largest, the strongest, and the most powerful nation-state in Europe. When the war ended, it ended not cleanly, not decisively, but in a way that meant a major war would soon return to Europe. The Peace Treaty of Versailles, a system of security which would guarantee peace in Europe, proved not to be a peace settlement. It punished Germany with loss of territory, with reparations. It demanded Germany pay tremendous sums of money for the war, paying to rebuild France, paying the debt the European countries owed to America. It punished Germany by destroying the nation's proud armed forces. The army was to be a fraction of its pre-war strength, and would be deprived of its most modern weapons. The settlement did not destroy Germany as a threat or as a rival. It merely provided Germany with yet new grievances. The new map of Europe created a patchwork of small, weak countries on Germany's eastern border. Countries with which Germany now had scores to settle. Versailles kept the war alive in the mind of every German. In a Germany resentful of history, in a Germany suffering endless economic crisis after economic crisis. A movement and a leader arose that gave voice to those resentments and promised action. A movement that promised Nazi Germany proceeded to systematically destroy the Versailles Treaty and the structure it defined for Europe. All over the continent and all over the world, the pace of change, the flow of events accelerated. Japan began on a path to militaristic rule based on a belief in Japanese racial supremacy. The Second World War really beginning perhaps in 1937, with Japan's brutal, furious and avaricious attack upon China. War returned to Europe in Spain, as the Civil War tore the nation limb from limb. The fires of war fueled by the extremes of fascism and communism, with the democracies standing in impotent neutrality. The second fascist power in Europe, Italy, embarked on a war of conquest annihilating the independent African country of Abyssinia. The lesson to the world was that violence was the means to the end and would be unopposed. Hitler rearmed the German nation, turning with hungry and aggressive eyes to his weaker neighbors. Germany was united with Austria, a move that made Germany even stronger. The democracies were torn. America retreated behind the oceans in isolation. France, in cynical defeatism, built the Maginot Line as a shield against aggression, but feared to renew the war. Britain had no desire for war and saw justice in Hitler's demands. The democracies aimed to resolve the problem of Germany without resorting to war. They were to use diplomacy, negotiation and fair compromise. Appeasement. It is the autumn of 1938, and Hitler has turned his gaze to Czechoslovakia. A conference of nations is called in Germany at Munich. After the Anschluss, Europe knew that something else was going to happen. Czechoslovakia was going to be that something else. In October 1938, the leaders of the great powers of Europe gathered at Munich for what was perhaps the first modern summit meeting. This was no stately diplomatic conference held in a palace. The leaders flew to a conference held before the world's press. Under the gaze of the public eye, the leaders spoke in sound bites for the media.
When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, out of this little danger, we pluck this flower safely.
The meeting was to resolve the problem of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a democratic state allied to the French. It was a thorn in the side of Hitler's state, physically thrusting into the Reich, politically challenging both the ideas and beliefs of Nazism. Czechoslovakia was an isolated state, with Germany between her and her French ally, and surrounded by states that were unfriendly. If the conference failed, if Hitler and the Nazis chose to act against Czechoslovakia, there could be no half measures on the part of Britain and France. There would be no sanctions that would help and no supply of arms. To protect Czechoslovakia from Nazi aggression would need full general war in Europe. The nation whose future lay on the table at Munich had a modern army, but was not a fundamentally strong state politically. Czechoslovakia was not a state of Czechs. The modern democratic society contained minorities of Slovaks and Hungarians, and above all, Germans, the Sudeten Germans, a 3 million strong minority living in the areas adjacent to Germany. The Austrian Anschluss set these people afire with excitement. They were aflame, ungovernable, stirred by a call of history, destiny, and blood. The citizens of Austria abandoned democracy for nationalism. The Germans of Czechoslovakia went the same way. Hitler did not stir up nationalism in the Sudeten Germans. He simply tapped into the passion and the desire that already existed. Hitler sought to liberate his fellow Germans. He wished to eliminate the Czech nation as an ally of the French, and to add Czechoslovakia's modern industrial economy to Germany. As the leaders gathered, both sides had differing goals. Hitler and Czech President Beneš wanted matters brought to a head. Neither wanted to compromise. The Czechs knew that any concession to the German minority would bring demands from their other minorities. Hitler wanted total success. The French and the British wanted a compromise, neither wanting to risk war or humiliation. In negotiation, the British, led by Chamberlain, actually thought the Sudeten Germans were a minority whose rights were ignored by the Czechs. The French had an alliance with Czechoslovakia, an alliance the French made for their own benefit, to threaten Germany with war on two fronts. Powerless to aid their ally, they desperately needed to avoid the humiliation of breaking their promises to the Czechs. Chamberlain reluctantly said, "If Germany did decide to destroy Czechoslovakia, I do not see how this can be prevented." The objective of Britain and France at Munich was not to restrain Germany and not to counter Hitler's ambition. It was to make the Czechs give ground, to make concessions that would prevent a general European war. The Czechs aggressively opposed concession. In the spring of 1938, they had mobilized their entire army and placed it against the German border, terrifying Britain and France. Throughout the summer of 1938, the great powers of Europe had circled around each other, guessing each other's intentions. Beneš, rejecting compromise after compromise, angrily accusing the Czechs of attempting to ethnically cleanse the Sudetenland. He insisted that the Sudeten people would only be safe as part of Germany. Chamberlain was certain of Hitler's good faith when the German promised that he had no further demands on Czechoslovakia other than the liberation of the Sudeten Germans. The issue came to a head with the international summit meeting held at Munich on September the 29th. Hitler made no demands at this meeting. He waited for the proposals to be offered. The Anglo-French offer to Hitler was everything he asked. The Sudetenland was to be incorporated. Chamberlain firmly believed that the incorporation of the Sudeten Germans was the right thing to do. The Czechs were told that if they did not accept, they, the Czechs, would be responsible for the war and could expect no help. The Czechs signed, and the Sudetenland became part of the German Reich. The Munich Conference is regarded in history as the definitive appeasement. It has made the word synonymous with betrayal. As we judge with the benefit of history, would we have gone to war? Or would we have seen, as did Chamberlain, principle and fairness coming together with expediency? Perhaps the words for which the Munich crisis is most remembered are not those of the agreement reached over Czechoslovakia. When that agreement had been made, Chamberlain requested another meeting with Hitler. He presented Hitler with the draft of a statement. We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries. We are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus assure the peace of Europe. Hitler happily and enthusiastically signed. It was this piece of paper that Chamberlain proudly waved to the crowds in London. It was of this that he was to say, "This is the second time that there has come back from Germany peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time." If the French and British leaders had betrayed the Czechs, if they had foolishly given in to Hitler's lies, it was a betrayal that was welcomed. It was a set of lies that the population of both democracies believed. In the streets of London and Paris, crowds reveled in the news that war was not to return to Europe. In the Sudetenland, the German population equally enthusiastically welcomed the advancing and occupying forces of the Third Reich. The democracies thought Munich a new Versailles, an epoch-making event that would establish a new order in Europe. It was to be a new system of security and peace throughout the continent. It would be a settlement that would kill Versailles for good, removing the tensions, the mistrust, and the resentment. It would replace a European order directed at Germany and German ambitions with one that was based upon fairness and justice. In hindsight, knowledge of what follows makes us see the whole affair as a fraud. The events at Munich were logical. They followed on from events which had gone before. The French had abandoned each clause of Versailles without a fight. The French did not fear military defeat. They had absolute faith in the Maginot Line. They saw no point in going to war over minor issues and abandoned their ally when it threatened to bring war. The United States was not present at Munich. In later years, America would congratulate itself at having had no part in the affair and condemned the other democracies. The lesson America drew in the medium term when Munich went quickly sour was that they should withdraw even more from world affairs. Yet Roosevelt's words on the agreement made by Chamberlain were simple: "Good man." It is a pointless speculation to wonder what if had America lent its weight to the cause of democracy at Munich. The Russians resolved that Britain and France could not be trusted as allies against Nazism, and that the USSR should seek an understanding with Hitler. Britain worked from a moral position. Britain's position was that Germany did have a moral right in the Sudeten territory. They saw the Europe that Munich created as a safer, more stable place. Once the authority of the Czech government was broken by the transfer of the Sudetenland, the state of Czechoslovakia fell apart along its own fracture lines. The Slovak minority came up with its own demands for independence and autonomy. The Nazis supported and patronized the Slovaks. The Czech government in Prague proposed occupying Slovakia with troops. Hitler promptly recognized the independence of Slovakia. The Czech state was destroyed, unviable. Hitler summoned President Hácha, Beneš's successor, and instructed him to sign away the independence of Bohemia, the rump of Czech lands, which on March the 15th, 1939, became a German protectorate. Britain's government did not see the German occupation of Prague as a break in the new order supposedly established at Munich. As the German troops brought Nazi rule to the Czechs, the British government held that the events simply proved that the Czech state was unviable, fractured by nationalities, and that Europe was made a safer place by its absence. Where the events really shifted, where history took a new path, was in a groundswell of public opinion. Perhaps in reaction to the joy of Munich, British attitudes in the streets, the views of ordinary people, changed. Hitler would never be trusted again. The British media turned against appeasement and called for Hitler to be opposed. If we seek a pattern, a rationale for the way history unfolded in the 1930s, we can see that all Hitler's ambitions looked to the east, not to the west. Germany had lost territory to France in the west, Alsace and Lorraine, but there was no clamour for these areas to come under German rule. Czechoslovakia. The peculiar Nazi view of the world envisaged a future world that was largely agricultural and saw German Aryan territory spreading out into living space, Lebensraum. This spreading of Germany would displace other peoples. Hitler saw this expansion as eastward into the vast spaces of Russia and the Ukraine. When the Nazi troops completed the annexation of Czechoslovakia on March the 15th, 1938, within days, German diplomats renewed demands of Poland, that the city of Danzig be returned to Germany, and that Germany be given a rail and road link to East Prussia, a German corridor across the Polish corridor. Danzig was a German city. The corridor was German land lived on by Germans, given to the new state of Poland at the end of World War I. The Poles rejected the German demands out of hand. The British government almost immediately offered Poland an alliance. Previously, Britain had avoided making formal promises and commitments against the Nazis. The alliance committed Britain, restricted the options open to the British government. France had made alliances in order to threaten Germany, but found itself in danger, not safer. Britain made its alliance as a gesture, as a warning to Hitler. It was a complete reversal of British foreign policy since the First World War. However, to what sort of country had Britain joined France in alliance? The lands which were occupied by Poland were territories fought over, shared and reshared by German states, Austria and Russia. The Polish government was not a democracy in the same mold as Britain or France. The Polish government was dominated by the military. The ruling party, the cleansing movement, attempted to dominate all aspects of Polish life. Poland was an aggressive country that sought to punch above its weight. It refused to contemplate a compromise. The Polish government was headed by men with the same appetites for bluff, who gambled on intimidating opponents, as did Hitler. The climate of aggression was hardening all over the continent of Europe. In the spring of 1939, Italy invaded and occupied Albania. Mussolini, always keen to emulate Hitler, always driven by envy of Germany, mounted an attack on his neighbor across the Adriatic. The victory of the Italians was easy. Albania, with a population of barely 1 million, was the most primitive state in Europe. Politically a tribal monarchy torn apart by feudal clans and factions, the country was taken over in days, with almost no fighting. The King of Italy declared the King of Albania. Mussolini intended that Albania be used as a stepping stone on a path of conquest throughout the Balkans and southern Europe to enable Italy to dominate the Mediterranean. In an attempt to head off war with Germany over Poland, Britain and France recognized and accepted the Italian action. Stalin was obsessed with territory and saw the extension of his border westward as a resolution of old scores, and in his paranoia, an insurance against invasion. On August the 22nd, a non-aggression pact was signed between German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop and his Soviet equal Molotov. The news shocked the world, and at a stroke, all strategies of the British and the French were in ruins. No one knew of the secret clauses built into the pact, that in the event of war between Poland and Germany, the USSR would attack in the east and take the eastern half of the Polish nation. Poland was falsely confident, knowing nothing of the secret agreement. Poland thought that Britain and France would attack in the west, causing Hitler to split his forces. In fact, when war broke out, the French did nothing and sat behind the Maginot Line, making small attacks, slowly mobilizing, calling up strength. The British were organizing the movement of their army across the sea. Hitler gambled that the French would not act in time and stripped the West of troops to bring overwhelming strength against the Poles. He planned a campaign so fast, the French and British would be forced to watch helplessly as Poland was destroyed. Poland's army was outnumbered, outflanked, and obsolete in equipment. The Polish cavalry still used horses. There were virtually no tanks, mostly obsolete aircraft, which had to counter a state-of-the-art Luftwaffe. On August the 31st, Poland attacked Germany. In fact, German SS troops faked an aggression. By the end of the next day, the Polish Air Force had been destroyed, and the German army was deep into Poland. On September the 3rd, France and Britain demanded Germany withdraw from Poland. War broke out, and British Prime Minister Chamberlain made an announcement revealing a bitter disappointment that he had failed to prevent war from returning to Europe.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The attack on Poland saw the first use of blitzkrieg by the Germans, a new type of war, using rapidly moving all-mechanized and armored columns, with coordinated air support, smashing through and around slow-moving old-fashioned Polish forces. The Polish army was rapidly surrounded, and cuts ignored the lessons of Poland. By October the 6th, all Polish forces had surrendered. Cynically, the Russians waited until it seemed certain that Germany would triumph and finally moved on September the 17th. The German victory was stunning. In less than a month, with a loss of less than 14,000 dead, the Poles were defeated. Britain and France were shown as powerless. An arms embargo, but the supply of arms was limited to cash and carry. Arms had to be paid for in hard cash and could not be exported in American ships. American public opinion was anti-Nazi and suspicious and fearful of Japanese ambitions in the Pacific, yet equally anti-war. Germany's ally Italy stayed out of the war, remaining neutral. In March 1939, Italy and Germany had finally made a formal alliance, what Mussolini grandiosely called the Pact of Steel. The pact declared that either country was to come to the aid of the other if attacked, and gave Italy a free hand to direct strategy in the Mediterranean. As the pact was put into writing, the Italians signed on the verbal understanding that war would not come until 1943. It is a fact of history commonly lost that the pre-war relationship between Italy and Germany was not strong. Mussolini resented Hitler. The Germans thought Italy's imperial adventures ill-advised. Hitler had hoped that a war might start between Italy and France alone, which might distract and weaken France. The British and the French hoped from time to time to prize Italy and Germany apart. The two dictatorships had differences over the Anschluss with Austria. Had Mussolini offered an alliance to the democracies, they would have accepted. Hitler and Mussolini did come to have a strong personal regard for each other, but this was not something shared by the respective military and naval commanders, nor by the ordinary Italians and Germans. Italy's strategic interests lay in expansion and control of the Mediterranean, the Lebensraum of the Italians, what Mussolini referred to as Mare Nostrum, our sea. War came as a surprise, the pace of events overtaking world leaders. No country on either side was ready to fight in 1939, and all were taken unawares by the outbreak of war. Germany worked to a long-term plan. Hitler had come to power in 1933 and looked for a period of 10 years before rearmament was complete and the Austrian and Czech territories absorbed. Italy was not ready for war and saw in the Pact of Steel a guarantee of 5 years' peace. With the British and French declaration of war, the fighting spread across the world. Both countries were the center of worldwide empires. Britain was to call upon soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, Canada and South Africa, the Dominions, self-governing members of Britain's family. These countries willingly and without hesitation declared war on Germany, at the same time as Great Britain. From the colonies of the empire, Britain was to summon Indian, African and Caribbean soldiers. French forces contained soldiers from Africa and Indochina. Presciently, some of France's toughest fighters were Vietnamese. The first week of the war did in fact see a French offensive in the west, remarkable in the fact that its effect was so limited. Small numbers of French soldiers pushed 8 kilometers inside Germany, to within sight from the air with bombs and poison gas. Futuristic theories of war predicted mass aerial assaults on the city centers. It was commonly held that no defense was possible against attack by bombers. Everywhere, shelters were dug. Sandbags were piled around the doors and windows of shops and public buildings. The people of Britain had been issued with 38 million gas masks. No citizen was meant to be without his mask at any time. This was a time when the life of the civilian descended into black comedy and farce. The gas mask's distinctive cardboard boxes and bags were too often turned into shoulder bags containing workers' lunch. A market in sandbags developed, with speculators having bought up supplies in advance of war. New ranks of officialdom appeared. Air raid wardens patrolled the streets. They were to warn of gas attacks by using children's rattles. They enforced strict blackouts at night, ensuring no lights could guide enemy aircraft. Chemical weapons meant that neither side in Europe was to risk their use at any time in the war. Britain and France, although having done all they could to avoid conflict, were in fact able to look to a coming war with confidence, not with fear. If the leaders of Britain and France laid out their relative strengths on paper, they could sleep easily. Counting the armies already in the field, Britain and France could more than match Germany's strength. When fully mobilized with all reserves called up, Britain and France combined could count on a total of 3 million to Germany's 2.5 million. Even though Poland's 2 million strong army had crumbled, and Germany could now bring all its strength to the Western Front, Britain and France could feel confident. The British Royal Air Force and the French Air Force combined were equal in number to the Luftwaffe. Of course, Britain liked to see itself traditionally as a great naval power. The concept of the alliance with France was that the Royal Navy would impose a naval blockade upon Germany, while the bulk of the fighting on land was to be performed by the French army. The Royal Navy was then the largest in the world. The British Navy's core of decisive weapons were 15 large armoured battleships and battle cruisers, 7 aircraft carriers, and over 50 submarines. France, Britain's traditional naval enemy, had a fleet of 9 battleships and over 70 submarines. Germany's navy was small, 5 battleships and 50 U-boats. In World War I, the war at sea had played a hidden part in the war. The German submarine campaign had nearly forced Britain from the war, destroying the imports of food from the Empire, which Britain needed to feed its population. In the later years of World War I, a fierce blockade by the Royal Navy had caused famine amongst the German population. Britain was vulnerable because so much of her food and materials came over long extended sea lanes. Germany, because her coastline was so small, easily blockaded, a few ports that could easily be closed. As the navies prepared for the war, it was thought that the war would be played to the same script as before. The pride of navies everywhere was the battle fleet. The fleet of large, fast, heavily armoured and heavily gunned battleships. The number and size of these vessels was taken as a measure of the virility of each nation. On these measures, the cards were stacked heavily against Germany. In World War I, the battle fleets of Britain and Germany had met for only a few hours. No lesson had been learned as to the value of the big gun ship. In between the wars, the size of the fleets and the size of the ships in those fleets were limited by international treaties. The coming war was to show that the battleship was no longer the capital ship, the decisive weapon of naval warfare. Aircraft were to make these ships too vulnerable to attack. A few cheap aircraft made on the production line in weeks could easily destroy a major warship that could take years and massive sums to rebuild. But this was not clear in 1939. Only some navies realized that the submarine was regarded as so potent a weapon that it had been banned by the Versailles Treaty. The submarine as U-boat is forever associated within the mythology of World War II as the definitive Nazi weapon. Yet, as with all navies, the submariner was regarded as a second-class sailor by big ship admirals and had to face a struggle to establish his worth. In 1939, as war broke out, Chamberlain placed the British Navy in the hands of Winston Churchill, naming him First Lord of the Admiralty. Amazingly, Churchill had held the same job in the First World War. Churchill had been the sternest critic preparing the British Navy for war, but a series of wild schemes began to emerge. He tried to draw Turkey into the war. He tried to place mines in Germany's rivers, to attack neutral shipping and ports, particularly those of Norway and Sweden, who were supplying important raw materials to Germany. Early on in taking office, Churchill received a personal letter from American President Roosevelt, who invited Churchill to keep me in touch personally with anything you want me to know about. The personal relationship between these two men, bypassing the administrations and structures of their respective countries, was to be of crucial importance in the coming years. As the Poles succumbed to defeat and occupation, Hitler offered Britain and France peace. He claimed to have no quarrel with France and desired active friendship with Britain. He called the war in the West a senseless waste of life and proposed a conference of the great powers that would create a new system of peace and security. He was rejected. We are so used to the story of World War, a globally consuming conflict that spread across the world, that the fact is lost that in 1939 the war was comparatively small and could be reasonably assumed to be soluble. In Europe, in October 1939, Britain and France were at war, as were Britain and France's overseas colonies. Germany was at war. Poland, an occupied, defeated country, sliced up and lost. The Balkans were at peace. Like Romania and Hungary, some were pro-German, some were pro-British, like Yugoslavia and Greece. Italy, Germany's ally, remained neutral. Spain, a supposed fascist power, was neutral. Belgium and the Netherlands were neutral. All of Scandinavia was neutral, yet were key suppliers of raw materials to the Nazis. Soviet Russia, a fearful, paranoid country, trusted implicitly in their new relationship with Nazi Germany and believed itself safe from attack and was neutral. America was neutral. Far away in China, another set of tensions and envy not related to Europe's problems had brought a savage war that had been raging for 2 years. These wars were yet to join up into a world war. In Poland, a new order rapidly came into force. The map was redrawn. The Soviet Union moved west, Germany moved east. In wholly Polish lands, those occupied by Germany and Russia, a fearful night of occupation descended. Soviet forces imposed a communist rule. All those prominent in the old regime disappeared. Over 4,000 of Poland's army officers died in a bloody massacre by the Soviets. In German-occupied Poland, a brutal regime lay across the land. Nazism's racial theories held the Poles as subhuman. Poland's large Jewish communities became the victims of the Einsatzgruppen, special SS squads designed to solve the Jewish problem. Freed of any fear of attack from the east, German will and forces turned to the west and began to assemble against the democracies. Yet as the war settled into its 3rd month, a strange calm descended on Britain and France. The shock of Poland's defeat receded. The aerial devastation by gas and bomb did not materialize. History was to name this period with supreme irony as the phony war. Next time on World War II, The Complete History, the war is fought in remote and distant places. At sea, huge ships engage in conflict. The British Navy corners the German battleship Graf Spee and forces her captain to scuttle his ship rather than face certain destruction.